I'm going to respond to some comments that have a common theme. They all have to do with purpose, or you could say will. There's also a blog post in which I respond to a comment that is related to these comments, kind of, or it's on the same general topic, but my response to it was really long, so I decided to do it as a blog post instead of audio. But because it's related, you might want to open that up. The link is in the description. You might want to open that up and check that out. That was a response to Leonard Erasmus on discussion Fixing Modernity 2. Okay, so I'm going to start with George Soros Intelligence Network, aka Carla Della Stella, on discussion modernity and the loss of purpose. I've got to say, Carla Della Stella rolls off the tongue a lot easier than George Soros Intelligence Network does. Okay, she said, everyone can choose the purpose of their own life themselves. That's a kind of vague statement, and I can think of three different ways of interpreting it. One is a kind of declaration of individual autonomy, right? Like saying, I should be free to do what I want to do with my life. Don't impose your values on me. Let me be myself. Let me pursue my own destiny or my own purpose as I see it, right? So you could view it as that, as a kind of declaration of your own autonomy with respect to society and culture, right? The cultural and social environment. You could interpret it as an axiom of liberal humanism, meaning that human beings have an innate ability to make good choices. Right? That this is an ability that humans are endowed with. They're endowed with the ability to make good value judgments. And I think this is an axiom of liberal humanism, right? This is a tacit assumption that we have this ability. And so we should be as free as possible to exercise our judgment and our will because, well, no harm can come from it. It's like only good can come from expanding your agency. There might be some limits placed on it by the necessity of society, like you can't go around murdering people or raping them or whatever. But as long as you're not hurting other people or damaging things, then you should be allowed to choose your way of life yourself, right? That is kind of a liberal humanist assumption. You can see that in the trans thing, right? The idea that, well, this is a good thing that you're free to cut off your testicles and pretend to be the opposite sex, right? That this freedom is good for you. Not that this freedom is harmful to you, not that having more agency could harm you, but that it will liberate you, right? It will allow you to do what you want to do, and that is intrinsically good or a general good, which is what people on the right sometimes refer to as fetishizing freedom. Thinking that freedom is this unmitigated good. And conservatives have a more constrained understanding of human nature, and they often think that people are better off being somewhat constrained, being somewhat guided in their choices rather than making them themselves. And they question the assumption that people really do make such choices themselves. But I'll get to that later, I guess. I have to give the third interpretation that came to my mind, which is one that applies to me, but I doubt that it applies to very many people, which is that we can pull ourselves out of the abyss of nihilism with pure will. So let me just point out the circularity of the statement. Everyone can choose the purpose of their own life themselves. It's circular because to choose a purpose requires a purpose, right? The purpose of life is the highest value. It's the value from which all other values are derived. So it's kind of paradoxical to say that you can choose the greatest purpose, the ultimate purpose, because to choose it, you must stand outside of it. And then on what basis do you choose it? With what value standard do you make that choice? Right? This is the problem of transvaluing values, I guess. I'm not sure. I've just heard that phrase. Apparently Nietzsche said something like that. But there is this question of how do you value values? What are good values? Well, you need a value to judge values. Anyway, that meaning is not very relevant, I think, because aside from a very few people, nobody is really getting to that philosophical level where they are staring into the abyss and, pulling themselves out of it by their bootstraps. So I think I'll just let that one stand as I've stated it, just that is a possible interpretation. And it's an interesting one. And it's one that applies to me, sort of, but I don't want to get into that. That would be a tangent. So I think what Carla meant, though, was the second, the axiom of liberal humanism, the assumption that humans have this innate ability to make good choices, or that choices are intrinsically normative. And if that's what she meant, well, then I think it's wrong. I don't think people have the ability to choose the purpose of life or to make choices on that big of a scale. Human rationality is constrained and it is scale dependent. People can be pretty rational about things within a very constrained frame. Like when they're choosing a brand of toothpaste, they could say, well, this one whitens my teeth and this one is better at protecting me from cavities. And I'm not even sure you can be rational about buying a tube of toothpaste, though, now that I think about it. Or a loaf of bread. People don't really make rational choices about most things, and even when they're making rational choices, they're doing that within a frame that is highly constrained by culture and by society. So this idea of the autonomous individual making, these free choices based on rationality alone, like based on pure reason, is a myth. We think and act within a very constrained context most of the time, and most people have never thought their way out to that or up to that scale, right? Like most people have never asked themselves what is the purpose of life, let alone answered it. They just take for granted that if they're doing what other people are doing, then, well, it must be the right thing to do. And if you said you have to choose your purpose of life now, they would just somehow beg the question. They would just use their intuitive values to, claim that, or to justify some purpose. Like, look at the things that liberal humanists claim to be the purpose of life. Like Steven Pinker talks about human welfare and flourishing. Maslow talked about self-actualization. All of these terms are meaningless. Welfare is meaningless as a purpose because it just means being good. It just begs the question in the word itself. The word itself means being in a good state. And the same thing with flourishing, right? So these people are just begging the question. They have some assumptions. They have some unexamined assumptions about what is good for the individual. And then they just use these meaningless words to refer to those intuitive assumptions. So, if Steven Pinker can't do this, what makes you think Joe Schmo with an IQ of 100 can do this? And I'm curious, Carla, I would really like the answer to this. Have you done this yourself? I'd really be interested to hear your answer. Okay. Oh, wait, though I wanted to say one more thing. If you haven't seen it, watch the video that I put out a long, long time ago called Philosophy and Caterpillars, because that is kind of about this fact that we are rational only on a small scale, and when you add up a lot of small-scale intentionality or rationality, you don't get large-scale intentionality or rationality. And you, Carla, as somebody who is, I think you're a mathematician, or at least you're mathematically educated, I'm sure you know about local minima, and that you can't, generally speaking, optimize a nonlinear function by just making stepwise improvements. Like if you just do things that are good on one scale, you won't necessarily attain goodness on a higher scale. Right? And that's part of the problem of rationality, that like with the caterpillar walking around the bowl, at the scale of a centimeter, he's doing great. He's walking along the branch, he's not falling off, right? His brain thinks, in quotes, thinks that the rim of the bowl is a branch, and he's doing a great job of moving along that branch. But at a higher level, he's doing a terrible job, right? He's just going around and around in circles on the rim of a bowl. So at one level, his actions are purposeful, but at a higher level, they're not. At one level, they work, they're functional. At another level, they're not. And one of the reasons to be philosophical is to raise the scale at which we are rational, to bring it up to a higher scale by eliminating assumptions, which widens the frame in which we think. But this creates a computational problem. We can't deal with all the information. We can't deal with all the possibilities. So we have to create abstractions to deal with things at a higher scale. And philosophy is the challenge of developing abstractions that can deal with things at the scale of a life or a society or the world or 10,000 years of history. And we don't have those abstractions yet in our culture. But that's one of the reasons why we need to have these discussions, right? We need to raise up the level of rationality, raise up the level at which we're choosing our destinies. Okay? This is something that I talked about in my response to Leonard Erasmus. So I thought I would mention that here, that, as a society, as a civilization, as a planet, we are flowing down the stream of history. We are not choosing our destiny collectively, and individuals are not choosing their destinies as individuals because we don't have this high-level understanding, this high-level conceptual framework in which to even frame choices at those levels. And another thing that I really should have read my response to Leonard Erasmus first, but it's just so long, because this would make more sense if I'd read it first. But see, the big problems in modernity involve will. They involve making choices. Like, for example, we are reproducing machines, right? But we did not evolve to choose to reproduce. We evolved to seek out things like sex and love and food and water. And when kids come along, we love our children and we protect them. We evolved to fight off enemies and avoid death and all of those things, but we didn't evolve to choose to reproduce. That just happened because it was an effect of those other choices, right? The big purpose of life, biologically speaking, was the result of a lot of little choices that generated a solution to that big problem of reproduction. But humans didn't conceptualize life as the problem of reproduction, so that they would see life as a lot of little problems that they would just muddle through. And I think that's how most people see life. Or that's how they deal with life, as a series of little problems on a much smaller scale. And that was okay before, but now we have removed ourselves from the environment in which our desires function to make us work, basically. We're broken in this environment. I mean, most people are. Most people don't reproduce. Now you could say, well, it doesn't matter if you reproduce, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's a value judgment. You're making claims about the purpose of life if you say that. And then the question is, where did you get that from? Because what if it's just a consequence of emotions that evolved to make you reproduce, but are malfunctioning in this environment? Would you still think that the purpose is whatever these malfunctioning emotions generate? And then there's another, since I'm rambling, I'll just throw in one more little thought experiment here, which is the thing I talked about in Saculina. What if a parasite invades your brain and makes you want something that is good for the parasite, but not good for you, or at least not good for you, conceived as a reproducing machine? Like, what if something invades your brain and makes you reproduce its genes or its memes? Like, what if an ideology invades your brain and makes you reproduce the ideology instead of having children? If you understood that's what happened, would you still think it was your purpose to propagate the ideology. Anyway, just raising those questions. Thanks for the comment. Okay, here's another one from Carla that I'll respond to. She said on the same video, modern civilization is a big global network of division of labor. One can find purpose in being part of the network, i.e. getting a job and thus contributing to global civilization. If one doesn't just think, I am merely doing this job to get money so that I can buy myself stuff to consume, but I am part of this big network of civilization and my work is contributing to keep it going, then it becomes purposeful beyond merely being a means to get money for consumption. One becomes part of something bigger than oneself. Of course, that purpose can only fulfill oneself when one wants human civilization to keep going to begin with. Okay, well, I don't think that's true, Carla. I think you're kidding yourself. I'm glad to see you're embracing capitalism. I wonder if I had something to do with that. But yeah, I mean, sure, modern civilization is a big global network of division of labor, coordinated through markets, and you certainly play a role within that big global network, but the role you play is so tiny, and it's also abstract, right? You're a tiny little replaceable cog in this vast machine, and if you disappeared tomorrow, this machine would not miss you. I mean, it wouldn't even notice, right? It would have no effect on the machine. I don't think that's how people get an intuitive sense of purpose. Yes, people can get an intuitive sense of purpose from their jobs or their careers, but that usually involves making the career into something that resembles a more ancestral kind of social environment, right? Like, for example, when I go to the coffee shop near here, I go there quite often, and they know me, and they remember my name, and I know some of their names, and I say hi, and we have a little conversation maybe or whatever, and we smile at each other. It's nice because it resembles an ancestral primate interaction, and because I see them almost every day, we recognize each other's faces, and that makes us feel like we're part of a group. But when I go to the grocery store, which is bigger, I prefer to go through the automated checkout so I don't have to deal with a human being, because I don't know the people there. I don't see them often enough. They change too often, or there are too many of them, or it's too big, or whatever. So there's no familiarity, so it feels awkward going through the checkout line. It's a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, it's not that bad. We have this facade of politeness that makes it bearable to interact with strangers. But we didn't evolve to plug into this giant global capitalist economy through economic transactions. We evolved to plug into small groups through emotional transactions. And so there's a mismatch between our emotions and what we actually do. Like, all of the transactions that really matter in terms of energy flows, like in terms of keeping me alive, are completely alienated from my emotions. They don't feel like they matter, right? Like when our ancestors went out there, when they were hungry and they went out there and they killed an animal, or they found some plant foods and they brought it back to the campsite, it felt real. There's a direct connection between the feeling of hunger and the action of hunting or gathering food. But let's say you're a programmer and you go do your job and you write some code, and that code is the reason why you ultimately have money in the bank that you use to buy food. But it's so removed by these abstract transactions that there is no relation between the emotion of hunger and the action of programming, right? And so that's a kind of emotional detachment. So then what are you going to be motivated by when you program? Well, you're going to have to be motivated by other things. Maybe it's just increasing the tokens in your bank account, or maybe it's impressing your fellow programmers with your clever solution to a problem, or something else. But the point is that the motivation for the action is detached from its actual function by these abstract relationships. And that's the nature of this giant division of labor. It turns labor, and I think this is one of the few things that Marx might have actually been right about, that, this industrialized way of life does alienate us from labor. It makes labor an alienating experience because we don't even know what we're producing half the time. We're producing some little thing. We're cogs within cogs within cogs in this machine, and we don't even really fucking know how what we do contributes to civilization. Or even if it does, like, half the jobs out there seem useless, and they probably are. They're just noise in the machine. The overwhelming complexity of it generates all this noise and inefficiency and stuff, and so your job might be negative. You might be doing something harmful to that big machine. So no, I don't think you can get a sense of purpose from it, like an intuitive sense of purpose or meaning from being part of this giant machine. Maybe you can. Maybe you personally can. Maybe you find this kind of exciting and interesting. But I think most people who are sitting in a cubicle, working on a spreadsheet, do not feel that what they're doing has any real meaning. They're just doing it to get that paycheck, so they can use the money to consume what they want to consume. I just think that's the reality. I'm not trying to be, negative. I mean, I'm just being honest. I don't think people can feel that way about this machine. I mean, this is something that really only abstract thinkers can appreciate, right? The beauty of capitalism as an abstraction. I can appreciate that. I totally do. But I don't think the ordinary person is going to get any satisfaction out of this abstract concept that, this spreadsheet is part of this vast global division of labor, and, it contributes in some way that I don't even understand to the production of the economy, right? But thanks for your comment. It was a good comment, even though I disagree. It's a good thing to think about. Okay, this is a long one, but this is a good one. Okay, I'm going to respond to this one. And this is by henryzeno. He said, "Hey, I subbed having seen you debate JF. I believe philosophy..." Oh, I should say what this is on. It's on Enmendham's Logic. All right, back to the comment. He says, "I believe philosophy has value and should continue to be studied and debated in elite institutions as well as the internet. That being said, I can't help but get disillusioned with it when I hear people such as yourself in this video espouse the notion that feelings don't matter. In the real world, we all kind of know that feelings just kind of do matter." Those are all caps, by the way, for emphasis. And by the way, all caps is kind of a tell. It's a sign that you're stumbling into your forbidden territory of your mind, right? Like, questioning this assumption is obviously triggering your amygdala. Okay, he said, "I fully realize that in a strict academic philosophical sense, my question begging wouldn't pass muster. But again, I can't help myself thinking, of course feelings matter. Any notion to the contrary strikes me as masturbatory intellectual game playing. But perhaps I'm just a Philistine? ? Okay, let me stop there and I'll respond to this part and then read the rest and respond to it. All right, so this is definitely not masturbatory intellectual game playing. It's kind of the opposite. There's no more important question than what is the purpose of life, right? There's no more profoundly important question than what is value. So this is not game playing. This is not, mucking around with words. This is the real deal. So there's a kind of irony here that what you're actually being disillusioned by is that there is real philosophy out there. This is not academic philosophy. This is real philosophy, right? Academics don't ask the question, what is the purpose of life? They fiddle around with some, paragraph of Wittgenstein or whatever the fuck it is, or some, they write endless, books on Hegel and shit like that. I mean, there might be some interesting stuff happening in the academy, but I doubt it. No, this is the real deal. This is philosophy. And yeah, it's going to challenge you. And that's what you're getting upset by. And that's why you're typing in all caps. Because it's challenging an assumption that you have had probably your entire life and never questioned. And that's exactly what philosophy is supposed to do. That's the whole point of it, is to expand rationality. It's to question the assumptions that we ordinarily are working with and maybe change them or maybe turn them into something that isn't just an assumption. Okay, he said, if I was to have a crack at the philosophy thing, I'd suggest that perhaps it's not necessary to justify the axiom that feelings matter. Doesn't the chain of justification ultimately have to end somewhere so as to avoid an infinite regress? Well, not necessarily. You could just say, I'm going to stare into the infinite regress. That's nihilism, saying I don't have a foundation. Becoming aware that you don't have a foundation is also part of the point of this inquiry, right? That's part of the point of Socrates and also, Descartes' cogito. Now, of course, Descartes was a bit of a pussy. He scrambled out of the abyss as fast as he possibly could by assuming God. So Descartes fell into the abyss, was in there for like 30 seconds saying, I think, therefore I am. And then he just said, God exists, and jumped out. So first, just understand that we don't have a foundation. That's part of it. And Inmendum is confusing his assumptions with logic, right? So Inmendum thinks he's constrained by these assumptions. Logic is a constraint. I can't really believe a contradiction explicitly. Maybe I could have two contradictory beliefs that don't get activated at the same time, in the same situation. But I can't explicitly believe a contradiction. So I am constrained by logic. But I'm not constrained to be a hedonist or to believe that pain and pleasure are the ultimate source of value. Okay. And understanding that that's not a constraint is part of a philosophical inquiry into the human condition, the condition of being a subject. And it's like finding out, what am I free to question? What am I free to believe? What am I free to think? Right? So I'm free to think, and my freedom is pretty broad, right? I might not be free to believe a contradiction, but I am not constrained to believe that feelings are the ultimate value. So no, you don't necessarily have to avoid the infinite regress, but if you're going to rationally avoid the infinite regress, then you're going to posit an axiom, or you might say a choice, a fundamental choice, right? An existential choice. So what Descartes did was pretend that God was a constraint. Oh, I can't not believe in God. It's just impossible. So I have to believe in God. Now I can believe in all kinds of other things, but I just had to get that out of the way. I have to believe in God, right? That's not really honest, or maybe it's just delusional. I don't know. But the rational way to deal with the abyss is to say, oh, the burden is on me to define, to choose my purpose, right? As Carla said, good thing her comment came before this one. Once I understand that it is an assumption, I am free to question it. And once I understand that there is no prior constraint, there is no purpose of life that is like built into me as an explicit thing, then I am free to choose one. But how free am I really? Well, anyway, this gets into what I was talking about in Lucifer's question. So I'm not going to get too deep into this stuff here because I'm just going to respond to this guy's question. But I guess the options are you stare into the abyss of the infinite regress and you accept that you don't have a foundation, or you posit an axiom, but then what you're doing is you're making a decision, a choice. The axiom is not your foundation or a constraint on you. It is a choice. So rather than you standing upon it, it stands upon you. So that's understanding the relation between these assumptions and yourself. Okay, then he said, it may sound like I'm begging the question, but I think the other guy's point is that feelings are the only game in town in terms of value. Right, that's what Inmendham believes, right? And I'm saying they're not. They're not the only game in town, and they're not even in town. And that's what the debate would be about. And that's what you're disillusioned by, is that there's even a debate at all. You don't want a debate. You just want that assumption to be left alone. Okay, he said, process of elimination is an argument of sorts? Question mark. Sure, process of elimination is a kind of argument, but have you done that? Have you eliminated anything? Like, what alternatives did you consider and then eliminate and say, oh, this one's left and I can't eliminate it? What was your process of elimination? I mean, I know the answer. You didn't do any of those things. It's just you've had this assumption, you've taken it for granted your entire life, and then you hear somebody question it, and an alarm goes off in your head. And that's what happens to everybody when their core assumptions are challenged. There's a kind of alarm bell. It's like a panic, like, what the hell is going on? Now I'm in chaos. Something I've always taken for granted is being questioned. You know, you've always thought within the frame that was defined by that assumption, and now somebody is thinking in a bigger frame in which that assumption is an assumption, not part of the frame, and that's sort of scary. I mean, it really is. It's kind of alarming. That's why you get that panic mode, and that's why you type the all caps. Okay, he said, I understand your point regarding the subjective-objective distinction, but subjective feelings occur within objective reality, right? No, not really. Well, in a sense, yes. Like, I'm talking about alarm bells going off in your head, and so I believe that objectively you're having a certain kind of mental state when you're experiencing something, right? Or like, let's take a simpler example. A little kid falls down and they hurt their knee and they cry, and I think they're sad. And that's, their sadness is an objective fact in that the objective mental state of sadness is occurring. However, the feeling of sadness only exists for the subject. I can't feel somebody else's sadness. So, no, subjective feelings only exist for the experiencer, for the subject. They are intrinsically subjective. So, without getting into too much detail, the answer is yes in a way, but also no in a way. The feeling itself is subjective, and it does not exist in objective reality. It only exists from a perspective, right? Like, there might be some brain state, there might be some neurons firing in a head, and we might say, well, this is correlated with this feeling, but you have only ever experienced your own feelings, and you will never experience anyone else's. So no, they don't really occur in objective reality. All right, he said, feelings matter to the experiencer. That's not true. Feelings are mattering. They don't matter. They are mattering. So let's say that you're hungry. Okay, that's a feeling. What matters to you is getting food. The feeling of hunger is not about itself. It's about eating. If you're in love with a girl, that feeling is about the girl. It's not about the feeling itself. So no, feelings don't matter to the experiencer. They are mattering. They are the experience of valuing. Like, let's say that, I don't know, I stub my toe, okay? I feel pain, right? My brain says, ouch. Well, that's my brain saying something bad happened. It's the stubbing of the toe that is bad. It's not the pain that's bad. The pain is the experience of that evaluation of stubbing my toe. So it's not really that feelings matter. Feelings give rise to mattering. And mattering is about things out there in the world. What matters to us is reality and our relation to reality. And value is a subject-object relation. I'll put out a video, probably after I put this one out, about ephilism. I've already made it. It's just waiting to go out. And I get more into this question of hedonism and and value and feelings and all that stuff. So I won't beat it to death now, but yeah, I think your assumptions about this are a kind of means-ends confusion between the cause of mattering and the end of mattering. Between the cause of behavior and the purpose of behavior. Feelings might cause us to act in certain ways, but they're not the purpose of action. Okay, anyway, he said, and the experiencer is part of objective reality, ergo subjective feelings give rise to objective mattering value. Well, I've already said that's not really true, and also, at least as I use the term, value is a subject-object relation, so it's about me valuing that. It's about the subject valuing something in objective reality. And our feelings are there to make us do things in objective reality. They're not there to make us feel them, right? They have a purpose. And the ultimate purpose of all of those feelings is to get you to reproduce, right? To make you move through the world in such a way that you leave behind a bunch of offspring, which is the ultimate source of value in the cosmos. Value emerges out of the cycle of reproduction in biology. Okay, anyway, I'm getting off on tangents, so let's get back to the comment. Okay, so he said, just because every inch of the universe, rocks, etc., can't experience those feelings, aren't they irrefutably real when we experience them? Yes, they're irrefutably real to us. They are subjectively real to us. But nobody else has access to your feelings, right? They are intrinsic to you. There is no way for you to transfer your feelings to me. There is no way for me to experience them. They're not fungible. They do not exist in objective reality in the sense that, an object does. Experiences cannot be extricated from the experiencer. And also they are transient. They only exist in this brief moment, right? And then they're gone. They're part of this stream of subjective experience that is real in a very strange sense. It's not real in the same way that objective reality is real. Okay. He says it's like saying it's not objectively raining just because it's only raining in New York and not in Washington. Well, it's not a great analogy, but it kind of supports my argument better than it does yours, because it's not objectively raining, period, right? It's raining in one place, not another. And so the analogy would be the feeling exists for one subject, but not for another. Your experience of pain is subjectively real to you, but it's not subjectively real to me. It might be objectively real to me in the sense that I might see you with a look on your face and I might think, oh, that guy is experiencing pain. But the pain itself is entirely in your subjectivity. I have no access to it. I can only imagine it. Okay, he said, sorry if I've strawmanned you, I'm no philosopher. No, that was pretty good, actually. You're more of a philosopher than in Mendham, because at least you grasp that there's some kind of axiom, that you're sort of bootstrapping yourself out of the infinite regress, that hedonism is not just logic or whatever. All right, he said, but that would be my first rebuttal attempt. Feel free to tear it apart. And empirically speaking, doesn't much of psychology attest to feelings being the bedrock of our values, and that feelings precede and determine our judgments' values? I'm thinking of Jonathan Haidt's work in The Righteous Mind, as well as random studies. Well, I think I already talked about that, so I'll just let that stand. I mean, I think I already sort of explained the relation between feelings and values, but there's a difference between us explicitly believing that something is valuable and having a feeling. Okay, so saying X is the purpose of life is not a feeling, it's a statement. So no, we're not constrained. It's not just logic, or we're not forced by psychology to believe philosophically in hedonism, even though, yes, emotions are what make us do things, and emotions are what generate value judgments, and emotional experiences are associated with value judgments. However, none of that implies that we must believe that pain and pleasure are the ultimate values. Okay. Anyway, this is a tough topic. I have talked about this before in passing, but I have never really done a deep dive into value and emotion and stuff like that. Partly because it's a tough topic. And I every time I have broached it in the past, there's a lot of pushback and anxiety and stuff like that. Okay, the next one, I think this will be the last one. This is getting really long. As usual, I'm rambling too much. But I have to read this one because it's really good. It's by Aesir Vanir. I think those are the different groups of Norse gods or something like that. Anyway, I don't know my Norse mythology very well. This is from the video Discussion, Modernity, and the Loss of Purpose. I hope my voice will hold up while I read this. I think I'm just going to mostly read it because I don't have any strong disagreements with it, so I think I'll just read it and maybe I'll comment a little bit. It's a good comment, so I wanted to read it. Okay. He said, I think you got to the core of the matter in that time fragment. We're born into a world where we don't have to do anything if we wish to do so. The logic of our modern liberal society is such that the traditional structure of the family as a unity embedded in a larger community is dissolved, which consequently fractured the reciprocal relation of dependency between the family and the community. This reciprocal relation of dependency imposed purpose onto a person, for she knew what was at stake if responsibilities towards the family and the community were neglected. A relation of reciprocal dependency is a Purpose an sich. I think that means in itself in German. Okay, he said, the only two ontological entities in a liberal society are the individual and the state. There's no reciprocal relation of dependency here, for the scalar increase of communities and the instantiation of the welfare state made the relation of dependency essentially move in one direction. The state's scope of influence is immense, and the immensity of its scope effectively deems every particular individual as an interchangeable unit. The state does not need you for its survival. Hence, we have grown dependent on this entity for our basic functioning. It infamously caters to our basic biological needs from cradle to grave, and other than absolute obedience to its rule of law, it asks nothing in return. You don't want to work? Here's a monthly paycheck. You have a child on the way? Here's some extra support, etc. While all previous civilizations conceived of work as a necessary evil, and leisure as the good life, in the Middle Ages, here in the Netherlands, we famously put our hands to the plow when the sun was already high in the skies. We are in the position to claim all the leisure we want, but to what end? There is nothing to do, nothing to explore. We're thrown into a world where everything is readily at hand. Life, conceived of as the struggle for self-preservation, has never been easier, and yet we have never witnessed the voluntary cessation of life in such quantities as we see today. We start this game with maxed out abilities. Nay, we start this game at the point where one merely has to watch the closing credits on the screen. All the hard work is done already. We know that the striving towards improvement is a purpose in itself, and the completion of a game is bittersweet at best. Uncertainty about the preservation of one's family and oneself, and temptation to discover the unknown, is both necessary and sufficient to instill purpose into anyone. When the former condition is readily satisfied by an entity that does not need you for its survival, and the unknown is readily explored, the cliché of being born too early to explore the galaxy is unfortunately true, then what is left? Religion? Exile? Doing what makes you happy? You see why I wanted to read that, right? It's very well written. It's almost poetry. I guess I should be very grateful that you're using my video as a kind of blog. So thank you for that. Let me just read. This is kind of silly, but I'm going to read something that I just found the other day. in an old notebook. I always carry around a notebook and a pen, and I have a tendency to sit in coffee shops or wherever and write my thoughts into a notebook, and then never never go back and read them again, so it's kind of pointless. But anyway, I was going back over these old notebooks that are full of scribblings and doodles and mathematics and diagrams and stuff and writing, and I came across this little thing that I wrote about 10 years ago. So I'll just read that as a way to end this. This is BG 10 years ago, and it's kind of interesting that I was thinking about the same kinds of things. Okay, this is what I wrote. On September 3rd, 2010, I was sitting outside a coffee shop in Seattle. I just saw a tragic scene. A guy in his 30s, with a potbelly, working in a bookstore, wearing a pill t-shirt. I was looking for Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger at Twice Told Tales. I was struck by the tragedy of that individual. Whenever my life seems bleak, holy fuck. Walking down here, looking at people, thinking about my life, about Junger, and about how war made him feel alive. We live such pointless, futile lives. Of course, that is by both psychological and physical necessity. Psychologically, life will always seem boring and frustrating because we always want more than we have. Physically, the majority of people must be frustrated because life is a zero-sum game at some level. Nevertheless, it is striking. Now, at this moment in history, life in the civilized world is devoid of conditions that call for a natural, wholehearted, and whole-minded response. If you are starving, cold, or something is trying to kill you, then you can unleash your full set of human capabilities and respond naturally to your emotions. Otherwise, you are repressed, boxed in, listening to Johnny Rotten, but meekly growing fat in a bookstore. Watching the tragedy of your life unfold, struggling against the inevitable, a poke here, a prod there, a minor rebellion occasionally, but basically a cringing, hopeless slave, coerced, conditioned, incentivized, trapped. So it's kind of emo, but and I thought that was kind of neat to see that I had written that 10 years ago, or, well, nine years ago, yeah. All right, anyway, I will end it there, and I will probably do more. I'll try to do more of these, and I'll try to go through the comments and respond to them in text as well. And as always, thanks for listening.